with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. We definitely appreciate you being here with us and checking in as always. Today, I just have a giant in the leadership studies literature, and I'm so excited for this conversation. I have George R. Al Goethals, and he is the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor in Leadership Studies Emeritus at the University of Richmond. Previously at Williams College, he served as chair of the Department of Psychology, acting dean of the faculty, provost, and founding chair of the program in leadership studies. Goethals' published books include Heroes, Who They Are and Why We Need Them, 2010, Heroic Leadership and Influence Taxonomy of 100 Exceptional Individuals, 2013, with Scott Allison. More recently, he authored Presidential Leadership in African Americans, An American Dilemma, From Slavery to the White House, 2015, Realignment, Region and Race, Presidential Leadership and Social Identity in 2018, and The Romance of Heroism and Heroic Leadership, 2019, with Allison. Goethals received the 2022 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association, and with Allison and Georgia J. Sorensen, he is the co-editor of the Sage Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies. That's 2023. Sir, you have been incredibly busy.
I have been, yeah.
Well, I am so excited for this conversation. Maybe before we jump in, what else do listeners need to know about you? Share a little bit about you, hobbies, what else you do when you're not writing books about leadership. What is Al spending his time on?
Oh, gosh. Al used to be a pretty decent runner, but at age 75, that had to stop. But I'm still doing writing and editing. I'm not being paid for it anymore. So I can't claim it's my job when I go off to the office, but I'm mostly a reader and writer of things presidential, which has been an interest for me since about third grade.
Oh, wow. Wow, really? Since third grade. So talk about that.
My parents had a picture of Abraham Lincoln in the house, and I knew he was the 16th president. I don't know what that meant to me at the time, but then I read a book on various presidents, and I learned about them. And when I was in fifth grade, my dad offered me $5 to learn all the presidents and vice presidents and defeated candidates. And most of that is stuck. So I've always had an interest in these guys.
And the defeated candidates, huh? That's. Yeah.
Well, they're much more important than the vice presidents, actually.
I imagine.
So it's really a lifelong interest in history, and then in psychology. I'm really interested in both. I took a high school psychology class. The first year was offered, and gosh, it was terribly dull. Just classical conditioning and so forth. And then the teacher, this is Winchester High School in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. And the teacher, who was a grad student at Harvard, came in one day. He wanted to talk about Freud.
Okay.
And I never heard the word. And he said, I guess I have to check it out with the police department and the fire department. And boy, that got my attention. And then he said, are there any students here who know that they cannot study Freud?
Huh.
I was astounded by the question. And a bunch of the kids raised their hand. Those are the kids who went to St. Mary's, the Catholics. So whatever this Freud thing is, it's on the Catholic list of forbidden texts. And I need to read it.
Tell me more. I'm intrigued, right? This Freud character.
And so that hooked me. So a lifelong interest in social influence, in group behavior, then that and combined with my interest in presidents nicely spilled over to research on presidential debates. So then that led me to, well, that didn't lead me, but I was fortunate enough to get a job offer at Williams College.
Yes.
In 1970. And one of the things I knew about Williams College, there was a professor there named James McGregor Burns, who had written a book called John Kennedy, A Political Profile, which is a campaign biography of Kennedy. And I happened to first encounter him in the summer of 1970 when Ted Kennedy, within a year, the Chappaquiddick disaster, was running for re-election, and he was giving a lecture in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, giving a campaign talk. And this man stood up and asked a question, and it was fascinating because it was both intellectually challenging, but just in the demeanor of the whole thing, it was clear that this questioner was a fan of Ted Kennedy and maybe the Kennedys in general. And I said, that has to be James McGregor Burns. I taught a little course during Williams Winter Study periods. It's an unusual pass-fail kind of be between semester courses and on presidents. And I invited Burns to come to class, and he talked about some theories of presidential leadership. So that was really our first meeting. And then the second meeting, one day he knocked on my door and he said, have you got a minute? And there was the great man, and of course, and he said he was interested in leadership. And he made it clear that it wasn't simply leaders, but the whole scholarly realm of the whole nature of leadership. He said, I know that I'm missing something. I need to understand psychology related to leadership. Particularly, I need to understand human motivation. And we chatted, and I'd asked him if he knew the work of Abraham Maslow. And no, he said. And Maslow was famous within the psychology for his hierarchy of needs and the basic idea that when lower needs are satisfied, like safety needs, then you go on to higher level needs like need for esteem and finally self-actualization. He was very intrigued by that. And I also put him on to the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, who talked about moral development.
Yes.
And he and I had some correspondence and a couple of further conversations. And he was really taken with those two theories, those two bodies of work. And interestingly enough, they have found their way into his most important contribution, which is the contribution, the idea, the notion of transforming as opposed to transactional leadership, which he defines as leaders and followers engaging each other in a way which raises both to higher levels of motivation and morality. He also talks about how leaders, by satisfying motives, can change them, which is right out of Maslow.
Yes.
And so my fantasy, of course, is that the notion of transforming leadership was born that afternoon, just about 50 years ago, when Burns tumbled into my office and asked about motivation, and then I guess he must have talked about moral development.
Well, I'm guessing if he's talking about motivation and morality, you had a little piece in that, sir.
Yeah. Maybe so. And one thing for the record, Scott, is that Burns is often credited with developing the concept of transformational leadership. And that may be one of the best known terms to come out of what one might call the leadership industry. Burns never used the term transformational leadership. It was always transforming. And transforming leadership, that concept has the moral component in it, which transformational does not, at least not explicitly. I guess good for Jim that transformational leadership is attributed to him as well. But I would prefer that people, when they think of Burns, think of transforming and think of the moral component, which really is central to all of his work.
Well, Al, I never had an opportunity to interact in any great depth with him. I saw him at a few ILA conferences and sat in some sessions, and of course was in awe. This might have been around when I was doing some of my PhD work, 2003, 2004, 2005, around then. But talk a little bit about Jim as a person. What are some reflections you have on him as an individual?
Oh, gosh, he was such an interesting person. Actually, I gave a brief eulogy at his funeral, and I mentioned the fact that when you called him on the telephone, 413-458-8607.
Wow.
And if he wasn't there, the answering machine would come on, and he'd say, "This is James McGregor Burns, Jim Burns." So there's always this double identity of, I'm a big scholar, I'm James McGregor Burns, but I'm also Jim Burns.
Yes.
And that's what I saw actually when in that Ted Kennedy rally. There was both the tough analytic question, but with a personal seal of approval somehow. It was just, and in fact, in 1983, I proposed to Jim that we have a retrospective on the 20th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. He said, "Great idea, you organize it." Which is difficult. And I did, and there was Burns and me and a sociologist and an economist. And he kept saying, "Now be tough, in your comments. That this is not hagiography. That this is a hard-nosed intellectual penetration of Kennedy." And of course, he was the anchor man, the last one. And I don't remember much about what he said, except that he ended with a very sentimental Yeats poem that related to Kennedy. So there was always the very personal, very emotional, and the analytic. He was very generous. He had his agenda, and one thing that I'm forever grateful to him for is he kept pushing me. Maybe starting back in the 70s, I really don't remember, to start a leadership studies program at Williams. And he had tried to do it. And I remember a meeting in New York where a classmate at Williams, Jack Sawyer, was former president, organized a bunch of people to push it. And I think Burns got a grant from the Oldham Foundation, I think, and a political scientist taught a course maybe back as early as 1990, but nothing came of it. Partly because Jim was retired, partly he wasn't as good at transactional leadership as he was in transforming leadership. But I was provost for 5 years at Williams, from 1990 to 95, and when I stopped doing that, I said, I'm going to teach a course on leadership, and that something of a break with my traditional social psychology work. And that led to a program, and Burns had his fingerprints all over that. He said, "Gee, do you mind if this alumnus audits your course? And let's have a dinner with it." One wonderful thing about that, so that goes back to 1997. He mentioned the James McGregor Burns Academy at the University of Maryland and Georgia Sorensen.
Yes.
And I remember being in Washington March 31st, 1998. God, it was a hot day. I went to College Park and I met Georgia, Barbara Kellerman, a graduate student there named Scott Webster. I don't know if he's still at Harvard. I'm not sure what's become of his career. He did a wonderful doctoral thesis on Spiro Agnew. But anyway, I got connected with Georgia, and Then I was asked to edit the Encyclopedia of Leadership by a small publishing company, Berkshire Publishing in Berkshire County, and they wanted local involvement, and I couldn't possibly have done that without Georgia, because she just knew the names and numbers and the players much better than I did, and also some of the work. And actually, let me back up, because before that happened, I'd become acquainted starting in late 2000, early 2001 with the Jepson School of Leadership Studies.
Yes.
At the University of Richmond. And Jim Burns helped birth that program.
So he did get it. He got it, just not at Williams.
He got it. I know the president of University of Richmond called a man named John Chandler, who was former president of Williams, and says, "This guy Burns for real?" Yeah, he is. And then, so Jim in the early 90s ended up as a senior scholar advisor for 2 years at the University of Richmond to help form the curriculum. And actually, the first year of the Jepson faculty, they didn't teach anything. It was all developing the courses. Wow. Joanne Schuler, Richard Kudo, Gil Hickman, Tom Wren, I think were all in that first group. I know Joanne was, and I'm pretty sure Dick Kudo.
Just an incredible team of scholars there that you just listed, right?
They were fabulous. And then Jim and Georgia cooked up this idea of collaboratively writing a general theory of leadership. And they
take listeners through this. I've never had this conversation on the podcast, and so I think that'll be a lot of fun. Take listeners through these adventures. So that fall, it was right after 9/11, actually, we convened in Richmond with the Jepson faculty, Georgia, Burns, a couple of other people. We tried various things. There were some presentations at ILA in Seattle in 2002. That was my first ILA in 2002. Yeah. And so I attended that presentation. Yeah. I don't know that I understood anything.
We talked about the Montgomery bus boycott. I think that was the leadership in relation to that. I think that. So I got involved by way of Jim with the Jepson School. I was on a sabbatical in spring of 2004 at the Jepson School. And Georgia was teaching a course there, and Burns had some appointment. So the three of us were there and working with the Jepson faculty. And I remember, I think the date is May 4th, 2004. I had become the organizer somehow of this project. And we met in the Dean's conference room at Jepson, and Michael Harvey and Mark Walker, a couple of other people were there. And I remember saying, as we started that meeting in the morning, that we either have a plan for book when we adjourn for lunch, or, we've been kicking this around for a couple of years. Various at ILA conferences and other ones. And by gosh, we did. And then later that year, one of the Jepson faculty, Fred Jablin, was tragically murdered by his ex-wife, and I think she was convicted of murder one. I won't go into all of that. But I'd been there for a semester, and the dean, Ken Ruscio, asked me, how should we replace Fred? Should we an organizational psychologist, or and I said social psychology?
I may know a guy. Yes.
And so I said, let me think. So I did some research. I made a list for Ken of some senior leadership scholars and then some of their students and younger people. And I was having lunch with him, visiting Richmond, and I'd done my homework, and I was going through this list of people, and he looked terribly bored as I was. And he said, "Would you be interested?" And and so that led to my job. I didn't start until January 2006, and I had a interesting conversation with Burns about that.
Oh, wow.
Because I was leaving Williams, and I had started the program in leadership studies at Williams. It was up and running. It was doing fine. And really, it was within a year of it being finally approved by the faculty that I told him I was leaving. And he was ambivalent. I mean, he congratulated me. So that's great. And since Richmond in some ways was as meaningful to him as Williams, in a more limited way, he said, yeah. So, and we kept in touch until the very end. And so it was interesting.
Well, I was saying to you before we started recording that really you are a part of my first academic publication, because the Encyclopedia of Leadership, which, I mean, this 4-volume, I can't even imagine the undertaking here, sir. But it's you and Georgia Sorensen and James McGregor Burns, or Jim Burns, depending on, and Dick Kudo, he was my advisor in my PhD program, and he got me looped into the ILA right away. And he started offering us opportunities to publish. And so I had written an article on how the Beatles were leaders, and David Sarnoff. And good. I am so thankful. And it's so interesting to me that now, years and years later, we're connecting in this way. And you were a part of my first academic publication. You provided so many individuals opportunities to contribute to that just incredible volume.
Well, I wish we'd had a chance to talk about Beatles, because when I lecture on Jungian psychology and the 4 types, thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation, well, I back up with Beatles songs that claim that Ringo is the sensation type, and that Harrison is the feeling type, and that Lennon is the thinking type. You say you want a revolution, and McCartney is the intuitive type, and that's why their music is so good, because it combines all of these functions.
Oh, that's awesome! I'd never thought of it that way at all. I'd never thought of it that way. But it would be interesting to watch the Peter Jackson documentary, the Get Back documentary, through the lens of, oh my gosh, did you have an opportunity to watch that? It was just fascinating.
No, I haven't. It is something on my list of things.
Oof. It's so fascinating. And, I have this dream. It's not something that is high on the priority list, but I think you could do a whole course on group dynamics with that documentary. I mean, it is fascinating to watch the nonverbals, or even just moments where Get Back emerges out of nothing, just Paul messing around.
Somebody asked me, we've had various discussions in my family about favorite Beatles song. I think Get Back is, it's hard to pick one, but that is certainly a contender. And the movie Let It Be, did you see that?
I don't know that I did. I did.
That came out shortly after 1970, and it's about a concert on a rooftop.
Yes.
And I know part of that finds its way into the Get Back documentary. And boy, there's a scene in there where McCartney's talking to Harrison, and you could just feel so much tension between the two of them. And Harrison was being sort of passive aggressive, and McCartney was trying to bully but not bully.
Yes.
And then Ringo walks in. Hello, Richard. So he sort of eases the tensions. Yes. So the group dynamics.
Yeah. Yoko's sitting there reading the newspaper while John's, trying to contribute.
Yeah. No, it's fabulous.
Well, talk about the Encyclopedia of Leadership a little bit. I think for listeners who are not familiar with this 4-volume set, just incredible undertaking. Talk about that project, because
that was a lot of work, and the people at Berkshire Publishing did most of the heavy lifting. It was very broad, had a lot of biographies in it, as you know. And sidebars, and very, very broad. And I think it contributed to the field. I know people use it. Gosh, it was a long time ago now. So you have to know that was done 20 years ago. And more recently, I guess 2019, Sage called me up out of the blue, wanted to do a second edition. Well, there are complications in the relationship between Berkshire Publishing and Sage, which I don't understand, but what we decided to do was a whole new project, Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies. And I asked Georgia whether you would like to be involved in it. She said, yeah, but you have to understand that my health is precarious. I said, well, but let's proceed as best we can. Then I also brought in my colleague, Scott Allison, with whom I'd written a couple of books on heroes and heroic leadership. And so the three of us commenced, and sadly, Georgia died just as we're getting off the ground. But she was a contributor just by her encouragement, her contacts, her knowledge, and so she's a full-fledged editor of the book, which came out earlier this year. So 19 years between the Encyclopedia of Leadership and the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies, and the latter is more scholarly, I would say. It doesn't have bios, and it just focuses on theory and research.
Al, would you reflect a little bit on Georgia, just because she was such a giant in the field, and I was interacting with her just as the podcast was beginning. I think I'd started the podcast in April of 2020, and we started to kind of interact about her being on the podcast, and she said, I want to do this, but then it was just a little bit kind of precarious. And so we never got to have the conversation. Her daughter, Susanna, has been on, and that was a wonderful conversation. But I know listeners would love to hear some of your reflections on Georgia as well.
Well, she became a good friend and colleague. We edited the book that came out of the General Theory Project, which is called The Quest for a General Theory of Leadership. And it was the impossible dream, the quest. And she stayed with us once or twice when she visited me and Jim in Williamstown. And, we just stayed in touch, kind of the three of us. But I had my own relationship with Georgia, which was mostly bouncing ideas off of each other.
Yeah.
And we did a couple of things together after the Quest book. There's a handbook of leadership that Alan Breinman, and I think David Collinson, and maybe Keith Grimm edited. I can't remember who the editors were. And Georgia and I, and the third author was a Paige. I'm forgetting her name. She's a student of Dick Kudo's. Wrote a chapter on the history and future of the General Leadership Project. But ever since I first met her in 1998, and she had worked for Jimmy Carter, and we talked about that, and among many other things, she was a dear friend and colleague who contributed a great deal to the field of leadership studies.
Exactly. Well, what should listeners know about the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies? Is there anything that you want people to, as we begin to kind of wind down our time, is there anything you want listeners to know? And of course, I'll put links in the show notes so that people can click on that. Yeah. But what intrigued you through this process? What kind of stands out for you as you think about this work? Because again, it's 2 volumes. It's a large undertaking.
Yeah. Well, just getting to know a much broader range of scholars of leadership than I knew when I started. I mean, I just didn't know that, as I said, the names and numbers of the players in a way that Georgia did, and I still did them when I started the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies, but certainly much more. And then through other colleagues like Joanne Chula and David Collinson, got to know a much broader, Ron Riggio, a much wider group. And maybe one of the most exciting things was to know David Collinson, and through him meeting some of the Brit critical theory people, Grant and Suze Wilson, Gareth Edwards, Bert Spector. Bert's not a Brit, but might as well be.
Either is Suze.
He's a Cardinals fan, and we share a lot. Just as a brief digression, as we shared baseball memories, I think I impressed him by saying, I remember being in the Polo Grounds when the New York Giants played there in 1953, and having my dad turn to me as an 8-year-old boy and said, "Al, don't ever forget you just saw Stan Musial hit a home run." But anyway, getting to know a whole new set of scholars. And
isn't it amazing? I mean, I've had a similar experience with the podcast. It's almost been 200 episodes, and I know so little. It's just been an experience in helping me and reminding me that there is so much to learn.
Yeah.
And I am constantly bumping up against new nooks and crannies of the scholarship, new scholars that I just think to myself, how did I never even know that this person existed? But, someone will be on the podcast and they'll say, hey, have you read X? And I'll say, no, I haven't read any Shelley Spiller. And all of a sudden there's a new world to explore, right? Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it?
So editing the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies with Scott, and again, Georgia at the outset, was really fun getting to know people, and especially some of the editing people needed sometimes to communicate more broadly than in their writing than they were initially. I mean, it is more scholarly, but when I write, I always have my mother and my many sisters in mind as the audience. That,
I love that. I love that.
That I want this to be accessible and not way back. I had spent a year on leave at Princeton, and three of us were in a room designing the next latest, greatest study on cognitive dissonance. And I said, this is great. The only problem is there are about 5 people in the world that are interested in this, and 3 of them are right here in this room. So I really wanted it to be the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies project, like the Encyclopedia of Leadership, to be accessible so people could read it and enjoy it. So.
Well, it's an incredible undertaking, and I will place links in the show notes, so listeners, you can locate and purchase your copy there. And again, just an incredible reference, scholars from all over the globe and how they're thinking about this topic. And if you want a source to better understand really the universe of this topic, just an incredible resource. Now, Al, as I close down with you for the day, I always ask guests what they've been reading or streaming or listening to, something that's caught your attention in recent times. What's been on your radar that listeners might be interested in?
Again, my continuing interest in presidential leadership. I've written articles for leadership after the election of 2016 and the election of 2020. I just recently finished a chapter for the Handbook of Critical Leadership Studies that Suze Wilson and Owain Smalovic-Jones are editing about Trumpism.
Okay.
Called Burning Love.
Okay. Back to the Elvis here.
My brain is flaming. I don't know which way to go. Well, Trump tells them you were, and the unique and fascinating in American history link between Trump and his base. It's fascinating. So that ties back to Freudian psychology and mob behavior that he wrote about more than 100 years ago. So I'm interested in that. The most recent thing is editing for Edward Elgar Publishers. I'm just starting case studies in political leadership.
Okay.
I've rounded up some of the same usual suspects, people that contributed to the Encyclopedia of Leadership Studies, and so that's an ongoing thing. So I'm still, as I said before, I'm still reading and writing and editing, just not getting paid for it anymore.
Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I mean, the contribution that you have made to leadership studies, the field of leadership, is just, it's incredible. And it's just an honor to be with you and hear some of the stories that you've shared. I mean, it's just really, really, I appreciate your time today. And I know that listeners do as well. So, I would love to have a conversation with you as we get further into the cycle. Again, looking at some of what we're seeing swirling around us is a little bit of a case study as we get further into that cycle of the campaign and how you see it, what through your lens you're observing. I would love to have that conversation at some point.
Okay, good. So, Scott, as you wind up, let me just say, as Jim Burns would say, bye for now.
One thing I just really, really appreciate about that conversation with Al is that here you have an individual who is modeling something really, really important. You have an individual who's curious by nature and contributing, curious and contributing, even after retirement, making sure that he is making a contribution and adding to our understanding of this concept of leadership. And it's been decades. Boy, I hope I am modeling that as well. I might be an emeritus, but am I still engaged, working with others and trying to help us better understand this thing called leadership? And so, Al, thank you so much for the work that you do, the contributions you have made. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful model for all of us. Take care, everyone. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.